What's up, everybody? It's your boy Sterling from ENT, and welcome back to ENT Fantasy Football. That feels so great to say. Today I'm coming at you guys with a solo video. Normally I'll be sitting here with my boys talking fantasy football. Today it's just me, and I'm going to be going over my overrated and underrated players for fantasy football in 2022. One of the biggest parts of the fantasy football season is coming up really soon, and it's the fantasy football draft. So it's super important for fantasy football. And so today I'm going to be helping you guys with some players that I think are being drafted too high and some players that I think are being drafted too low that I think are values at that position. So there might be some hot takes in this video. There might be some surprises. You never know. Before we get into today's video, make sure you guys go down below, go like, go subscribe to this channel if you're new or if for some reason you haven't subscribed already. And also leave a comment down below. Leave a comment about a player that you think is overrated or underrated. It doesn't even have to be for fantasy football. It could just be normal football if you think Travis Kelce is overrated for whatever reason. Just leave it down below. Just comment your thoughts. But without further ado, let's get into my overrated and underrated players. So the way I have it formatted is I'm going to be going over one player that's overrated and one player that's underrated for each position. So I'm going to be starting off with the running backs. My first overrated running back for this season is going to be Najee Harris. Now, obviously, Najee Harris had a phenomenal rookie year. He was incredible for a rookie. He actually finished as the running back 4 in fantasy football for last season. So he was the 4th ranked running back. And this season, he's actually being drafted. His average draft position is the running back 5. He's the 5th running back taken in fantasy football drafts this year. So last season, Najee Harris finished with 307 carries and 74 receptions. So he had almost 400 touches in total last season, which is top of the line. That's a complete workhorse running back workload. Top of the line running back workload right there. Najee Harris also was on the field for 980 snaps last season. Now that would put him second most of any running back in the last 5 years. So obviously that's, again, a top-of-the-line running back workload. That's unlike no other. That's an every down player, every snap player pretty much. My one concern about this, last year Najee Harris was purely dominant because of his workload and because of his volume. And so the coaching staff has already come out and said that they're looking to tone down Najee Harris's volume this season. Because for a rookie running back on a young team who's trying to be building up to eventually be a contender, that's not going to be sustainable for the future. You can't have Najee Harris on the field getting that many touches year after year, especially with the lifespan of a running back. And another thing that I'm factoring into this is Najee Harris was actually an inefficient runner last season. So Najee Harris last year, he finished with the 4th most yards of all running backs with 1,200 yards. He had the 2nd most carries, but he also finished as 38th in yards per carry. Now, you could say that yards per carry is a little bit of a skewed stat because a backup running back can just come in, get a 17-yard run, and now all of a sudden they have a higher yards per carry than Najee Harris. You can say that. But the point I'm trying to make here is Najee Harris last year was purely dominant because of his workload and because of his volume. He's not a big player who is going to break off a 45-yard touchdown run. That's just not who Najee Harris is. He's a pound the ball down your throat type running back. And if he's not getting the volume and the workload that made him successful last season, he's not going to finish as a top 5 running back again, and that's where he's being drafted. He's being drafted in the middle of the 1st round, and so I would rather have a guy like Austin Eckler, for example, in the middle of the 1st round than a guy like Najee Harris. Now, I'm not saying Najee Harris is all of a sudden just going to be a bum. He's going to finish as like the 16th running back. I think he's still going to be a RB1. He's going to finish in the top 12, but I have him more towards the lower end of the top 12 just because his workload is going to come down, and that's what made him so successful in the first place. So my second running back on this list is my first underrated player of the video, and it's going to be James Conner, the running back for the Arizona Cardinals. So James Conner is currently being drafted as the 15th running back taken off the board in fantasy football drafts. Now, last season, James Conner actually finished as the RB5, one spot behind Najee Harris, and he's being drafted 10 picks below Najee Harris this season. So obviously there's a discrepancy right there. Another huge factor is that last year, Chase Edmonds was getting the majority of the workload. And Chase Edmonds obviously is now on the Miami Dolphins. So last season, when Chase Edmonds was starting and in the lineup, James Conner was getting 13 touches a game and averaging 58 yards a game. But when Chase Edmonds was injured and out of the lineup last year, James Conner was averaging 21 touches and 108 yards a game. So 21 touches and 108 yards a game is beautiful. That's what you would need for your RB1 in fantasy football. Chase Edmonds is now out of the picture, and so James Conner is the undisputed, not an argument at all. He's going to be the RB1 for the team. And James Conner is a huge touchdown machine. The Cardinals' goal line offense last year, and that to me is going to continue. And so James Conner to me is being very underrated and overlooked this year for fantasy football. All right, so now that the running backs are out of the way, we'll get into my wide receivers. So again, starting off with my overrated player, my overrated wide receiver is going to be Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel last year, he actually finished as the wide receiver too, and so the only player that outscored him last year was Cooper Kupp, obviously. The thing that's turning me off this year is that, first of all, Deebo Samuel has already been showing frustration. He's been holding out of the OTAs, he's been holding out of the preseason minicamp stuff and all that. He's frustrated. And the main thing that he wants is, because of his workload and his role on this team as like the wide back, like half running back, half wide receiver, he doesn't want that role this season. He wants to be used as more of a traditional wide receiver. And I understand that. Why take all those extra hits and all that extra punishment on your body if you're not going to be paid and rewarded for it? The thing about that is that for fantasy football, Deebo Samuel, 21% of his fantasy points came last year from either rushing touchdowns or rushing yards. Now, last season, Deebo Samuel finished with 8 rushing touchdowns, which is by far and away the most for any wide receiver. The second most was 2. And so it's going to be super hard to repeat what he did last season if he's not being used in that hybrid role like he was last season. If he's going to be a traditional wide receiver, obviously Deebo Samuel is going to be great for fantasy, but he's not going to be top 6 wide receiver good. You see what I'm saying here? So my underrated player for the wide receiver position is going to be the second-year wide receiver, Amon-Ra St. Brown. So a lot of people are getting turned off from Amon-Ra St. Brown because the team addressed their wide receiver position this past offseason. They drafted Jameson Williams with, I believe, the 11th pick in the draft, and he was like arguably the number 1 wide receiver prospect in the draft. And they also went out and signed DJ Chark. So that's 2 wide receivers who are now in the wide receiver room who are going to be competing with Amon-Ra St. Brown for targets and touches. My thing with Amon-Ra St. Brown, though, is that I think he's going to be okay. I think he's going to be just fine. Last season in half-point PPR leagues, he finished as the wide receiver 24. So he was a wide receiver 2 last season. And by the way, last season in weeks 12 through 17, he finished as the wide receiver 3 in that time span. He finished ahead of guys like Jamar Chase. Think about how good Jamar Chase was doing in that time frame. Finished ahead of guys like Justin Jefferson. And also, of all the wide receivers, he's the only one who has a legitimate rapport with quarterback Jared Goff. He's entering his second season. I think he's going to continue to make leaps and bounds as a player, as we saw in his first season. His rookie year, he started out the season with some inconsistencies, but like I said, weeks 12 through 17, he was phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. He averaged 21.3 fantasy points per game in that time span, and I think he's going to continue to make leaps and bounds in his second year. So now on to the tight end position. The tight end is a super crazy position for fantasy football, and my overrated player is going to be the Buffalo Bills tight end Dawson Knox. So last season, Dawson Knox finished as the tight end 11 on the season, but let me show you some numbers right here. So last year, Dawson Knox finished with 587 receiving yards, which it's obviously not the greatest. He didn't even touch 600 receiving yards, but he did have 9 touchdowns. And so the 9 touchdowns is what brought him up into that tight end 11 territory right there. But I don't think that's going to be sustainable. He was extremely reliant on touchdowns this season. And so another factor is that last season there was pretty much no other tight end on the Bills to compete with Dawson Knox for those tight end reps and those snaps. This season, they brought in O.J. Howard. Now, obviously, O.J. Howard is not some world beater, insanely good tight end, but he is another guy who's going to be competing with Dawson Knox, and Dawson Knox isn't going to be the only tight end getting snaps. In last year, in his 8 games that he didn't score a touchdown, he averaged 6.4 fantasy points a game. 6.4 fantasy points a game. That's literally irrelevant territory. Like, if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's hurting your fantasy football team if you're starting him. He's being drafted ahead of guys like Mike Gesicki, Pat Freiermuth, and Zach Ertz. Why? For what reason is he being drafted ahead of those guys? It is not making sense to me. I don't think that's a good draft pick, and I would stay away from Dawson Knox this year. My underrated tight end on this list is Zach Ertz. So, Zach Ertz, obviously we've seen him be a great tight end in fantasy football before. Obviously, it's been a couple years. He was very good for fantasy football last year with his new role on the Cardinals with the air raid offense, and just in a new situation, new scenery, fresh start. I think it really helped Zach Ertz. And so my main thing that is keeping my outlook very good for Zach Ertz this year is that last season, DeAndre Hopkins missed a lot of games. And in those games when DeAndre Hopkins missed, Zach Ertz led the team in targets. He led the team in target percentage as well. Now, for the first 6 games of this season, DeAndre Hopkins is suspended. He's not going to be playing football those first 6 games. Now, you may say, well, the team brought in Marquise Brown knowing that DeAndre Hopkins was going to be missing those games, so that might take away from Zach Ertz. Now, think about this. What type of player is Marquise Brown? Marquise Brown is a down-the-field target. He's not going to be hyper-targeted like a player like DeAndre Hopkins would be. Zach Ertz, to me, is still going to be the target leader for the team in those first 6 games. And when Hopkins does come back, Zach Ertz is going to have huge touchdown upside. This is going to be a great offense. The air raid offense has already proven to be great, and you're adding in a deep threat like Marquise Brown with DeAndre Hopkins on the other side, Zach Ertz as the tight end. Like, that's going to be a very good offense. They're going to be moving the ball. There's going to be more touchdown opportunities. I'm really in on Zach Ertz this year. Dawson Knox is being drafted above Zach Ertz. So what sense does that make? Like, legitimately, why is he being drafted higher? These two players are being drafted around the same area. If you're going to be drafting a tight end in this area, skip out on Dawson Knox, get Zach Ertz. And now for our last position of this video is the quarterback position. So my overrated quarterback, it might shock some people, might surprise some people, is going to be Patrick Mahomes. Now, Patrick Mahomes, let's not get him mistaken, he's probably the best real-life NFL quarterback. If you're taking out fantasy, taking out numbers and all that, he's the best real-life quarterback. But we're talking about fantasy football here. So Patrick Mahomes has not lived up to his average draft position since 2018. It was his second season where it was his first year as the starter, and nobody knew Patrick Mahomes was going to be Patrick Mahomes. He was being drafted like in the last rounds of draft, not even drafted. So like, obviously that makes sense, but he has not lived up to his average draft position ever since that season. And also, this is the worst that his options have been since that year. Since he became a starter, this is the worst that his wide receivers are going to be. Now, obviously, they brought in some nice guys. They brought in Juju Smith-Schuster. They brought in Marquez Valdez-Scantling. They drafted Sky Moore in the first round. So there's going to be players, but with the subtraction of Tyreek Hill, Patrick Mahomes isn't going to have as many of those huge 60, 70-yard touchdowns, 50-yard touchdowns like he would normally have. So his upside is going to be hurt by that, and he's still being drafted as one of the top quarterbacks in fantasy football. Now, Patrick Mahomes is still going to be great for fantasy, but is he going to live up to his average draft position? I wouldn't select Patrick Mahomes ahead of Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson. I believe Patrick Mahomes is probably still going to be towards the top tier of quarterbacks, but I'm not picking him ahead of those guys in the top tier. He's kind of at the bottom of the top tier for me this year. And so that's how I'm feeling about Patrick Mahomes this year. He's still going to be very good, but is he going to be worth the pick that you're selecting him with? For my last player of this video, it's obviously going to be another quarterback, and this is my quarterback that I think is going to be underrated this year, and it's going to be one Trey Lance. Now, Trey Lance has the ability to be a top 8 quarterback in fantasy football this year, in my opinion, with the weapons that he has. With the way that this offense is set up to play to his strengths, this offense was set up to make it easy on the quarterback. The game-changing point about Trey Lance is going to be his legs. He's going to be running the ball a lot. And we've seen running quarterbacks for fantasy football are cheat codes. Think about Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts for last season in real life was not very good in real life. But for fantasy, he was getting top finishes left and right. And so do I think Trey Lance can replicate what Jalen Hurts did last year? Absolutely. If I'm not mistaken, Jalen Hurts finished as the quarterback 11 or 10 last year. Think about the options that Jalen Hurts had to throw to. Devonta Smith was his best wide receiver. Trey Lance is going to have Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle to throw the ball to. Those 3 guys are all better than Devonta Smith as pass catching options. And also, you're adding in the running ability and how this offense is going to be designed. Trey Lance, if everything goes right for him, is going to be great for fantasy football this year. And he's being drafted super low. The thing about Trey Lance is that he's going to be a huge boom or bust player for fantasy football this year. He's either going to be absolutely phenomenal or he's not going to be very good. I'm taking a flyer on Trey Lance this year. Now, what I'm doing, this is my plan going into a lot of my leagues this year drafting. So if you select like a safe quarterback, you can pick Trey Lance as your second quarterback, and Trey Lance will have the ability to be a huge ceiling player. This is the thing about fantasy football. Getting 20 points for your quarterback is not going to win you a fantasy football week. It'll keep you afloat, but it's not going to win you a fantasy football week. Getting 34, 33 points from your quarterback is going to win you fantasy football games. Trey Lance, at his best, is going to win you fantasy football weeks with his rushing ability, purely off his rushing ability. We've seen rushing quarterbacks are cheat codes for fantasy. But that's going to be it for today's video, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for watching the entire video. Go down below, like I said earlier, comment. Comment what you thought about these players. Comment, maybe you think Najee Harris is going to be a top 5 running back again. Maybe you think Patrick Mahomes is going to finish as a top 3 quarterback. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Go down below and like and subscribe. I'm out of here.